The first-class cabin hummed softly. Champagne flutes clinked, leather seats creaked, and muted conversations blended into white noise. Zoe Carter sat in seat 1A, her headphones sealing her in a bubble of calm. Her pencil glided across the sketchbook, in her lap outlining a dress design inspired by the cabin's sleek curves. This seat wasn't just a luxury, it was a promise. Her father's promise that she belonged in spaces people like her had been told they didn't. A flight attendant walked by, pausing briefly to glance at Zoe's sketch. "That's beautiful," she said, her tone genuine. Zoe nodded thanks but kept drawing, her focus unbroken. Nearby, a man in a tailored suit eyed her over his newspaper. His gaze lingered a beat too long, his lips tightening as though her presence puzzled him. Zoe didn't look up, but her grip on the pencil tightened slightly. She had learned to ignore stares like his, the kind that questioned her right to occupy space meant for certain people. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane taxied toward the runway. Zoe flipped to a fresh page, her pencil sketching faster now. Sharp lines, bold shapes, a design that refused to shrink. A voice cut through her focus. "Excuse me, miss." Zoe looked up. Claire Hendricks stood over her, a clipboard clutched to her chest, her smile thin and rehearsed. Zoe looked up slowly, pulling her headphones down to rest around her neck. Claire Hendricks stood over her, clipboard in hand, her smile tight and deliberate. "Excuse me, miss," Claire began, her tone polite but sharp. "There's been a seating error. This seat is reserved for paying first-class passengers." Zoe blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "I am a paying passenger," she replied calmly, her voice steady but soft. Claire's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced at Zoe's sketchbook and then back at her. "I'll need to see your ticket and payment confirmation," she said, her words clipped and efficient. She had been here before, not in this exact seat or with this exact person, but in this moment of being asked to prove she belonged. Zoe reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, opening the digital ticket without a word. She handed it to Claire, who scanned it quickly but skeptically. "This must be a glitch," Claire said after a pause, handing the phone back. "I'll have to move you to the economy." Zoe frowned slightly, keeping her voice measured. "My dad booked this seat for me." Claire's smile tightened further as she leaned in slightly. "I'm sure he did," she said with a faint smirk. "But let's not make a scene." Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at the exchange but saying nothing. The man with the newspaper lowered it slightly, watching with quiet curiosity before looking away again. Zoe held Claire's gaze for a moment longer before slipping her phone back into her bag. Her grip on the strap tightened as Claire straightened up and gestured toward the aisle. Claire's tone sharpened as she gestured toward the aisle. "This seat is reserved for paying passengers, miss. I'll need you to move now." Zoe sat still, her sketchbook resting on her lap. "I already told you," she said softly, her voice steady but restrained. "My dad booked this seat." Claire sighed audibly, her smile fading into something colder. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound authoritative, but still condescending. "I don't want to escalate this, but you're making it difficult for everyone here." Nearby passengers exchanged glances, their unease palpable. A woman in pearls adjusted her scarf unnecessarily, pretending not to notice. The man with the newspaper folded it carefully, his eyes flicking toward Zoe and Claire, but remaining silent. She had faced moments like this before. Being told she didn't belong, being asked to prove herself in spaces that were supposed to be equal. But no matter how many times it happened, the sting of it never dulled. Claire pulled out her clipboard again and tapped it lightly with her pen. "This is protocol," she said firmly, as though the word itself justified everything. "We can sort this out after takeoff." Zoe's grip on her bag tightened, but she didn't move. Her voice was calm but edged with frustration as she replied, "There's nothing to sort out. I belong here." Claire smirked faintly, straightening up and glancing at the other passengers as though seeking validation. "Let's not make a scene," she said again, louder this time. The silence that followed was heavy, complicit and unbroken, as Claire gestured for Zoe to follow her down the aisle. Zoe stood slowly, her sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest. Claire gestured toward the aisle, her smile gone now, replaced by an expression of cool authority. "This way, miss," she said, her voice clipped. She had been told before that she didn't belong, in classrooms where teachers skipped over, her raised hand in stores where security guards followed her too closely. But this time, it felt heavier. This time, everyone was watching. As Zoe stepped into the aisle, the first-class cabin fell silent. The soft hum of champagne flutes and murmured conversations had disappeared entirely. Passengers averted their gazes as she passed, pretending to adjust their headphones or scroll through their phones. A young boy stared openly from his seat until his mother whispered sharply, "Don't stare." He turned away quickly, but his curiosity lingered in the air. Zoe's steps were measured and deliberate as she walked down the aisle. Her grip on her sketchbook tightened with every step, her knuckles white against the cover. She had learned to carry herself with dignity in spaces that tried to push her out. But each time it happened, it chipped away at something inside her. Claire followed closely behind, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. She didn't look at Zoe. Her focus was on maintaining control of the situation. As Zoe reached the curtain separating first class from economy, she glanced back briefly at the passengers who had watched silently as she was escorted out. No, one met her gaze. The curtain separating first class from economy swished shut behind Zoe, leaving her in the narrow aisle of the economy cabin. She sat down in the first available seat, her sketchbook still clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes dropped to the blank page in front of her, but she couldn't bring herself to draw. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about everything the seat represented. Her father had always told her she belonged anywhere she wanted to be, but right now it didn't feel that way. Meanwhile, back in first class, the cabin door opened again. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped inside, his presence commanding without effort. The pilot greeted him warmly from the cockpit entrance. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter," he said with a smile. Marcus Carter nodded politely, adjusting his cufflinks as he stepped into the cabin. His eyes scanned the rows of seats briefly before settling on Claire, who was standing near the galley with her clipboard. She froze when she saw him, her confident demeanor faltering for the first time.
That day,
Marcus Carter, a self-made billionaire and CEO of one of the most successful companies in the country, had just boarded the same flight where his daughter had been removed from first class. Claire's smile returned quickly, though it was thinner now, more forced. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice higher than usual. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward seat 1A, the seat Zoe had been forced to leave, and then back at Claire. His expression hardened slightly as he asked calmly, "Is there an issue with my daughter's seat?" Conflict. The driveway was quiet except for the hum of police radios and the sharp beam of a flashlight cutting through the night. Marcus Carter stood still, his tailored suit wrinkled from a long day, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of restraint. "Do you live here?" the officer asked, his voice flat but edged with suspicion. Marcus nodded calmly. "Yes." "Proof?" the officer demanded, his flashlight lingering on Marcus's face longer than necessary. Marcus reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet with deliberate care. Even here, in the home he had built to escape judgment, it followed him like a shadow. The officer scanned the ID, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Carter," he muttered under his breath before handing it back without apology. Marcus didn't flinch as the officer tipped his hat and walked back to the patrol car. The taillights disappeared down the street, leaving Marcus alone in the cold silence of his gated community. He had built this life brick by brick, but no amount of success could shield him from assumptions. That night, Marcus sat in his study, staring at a framed photo of Zoe on his desk. She was smiling brightly, holding her sketchbook close to her chest. He bought the Airline not for revenge, but for change. He wanted spaces where people like Zoe wouldn't have to prove they belonged. But he kept his ownership private, Knowing tokenism wouldn't fix what decades of bias had broken. The aisle was silent except for the soft shuffle of footsteps. Zoe clutched her sketchbook tightly as she followed Claire down the narrow path, her head held high despite the weight pressing on her chest. She had learned to walk through moments like these, moments where people decided she didn't belong, but it never got easier. As Zoe passed the first-class passengers, their gazes shifted away. A woman adjusted her scarf unnecessarily, pretending to focus on the drink menu. A man folded his newspaper with exaggerated care, his eyes flicking toward Zoe briefly before looking away again, but not everyone looked away. A young woman in the middle row raised her phone discreetly, angling it to capture Zoe's walk. Her fingers moved quickly, typing a caption, "Arser first class while black." This wasn't just about Zoe, it was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The phone in that woman's hand was about to spark something bigger than anyone in that cabin could imagine. Zoe reached the curtain separating first class from economy and paused for a moment. She glanced back at the passengers who had watched silently as she was escorted out. No one met her gaze except for the woman with the phone, who gave a small nod before lowering it. Hours later, the video would surface online, its caption igniting conversations across platforms. "This happened to my son last week. She's just a kid. Hold them accountable." The silence of the first-class cabin would be replaced by a roar. Claire sat in the break room, her uniform crisp, her clipboard resting on the table beside her. The faint hum of the coffee machine filled the silence as she adjusted her name tag. 20 years in this job, and she had learned one thing: standards mattered. Without them, chaos followed. Flashback. A black couple stood at the counter, their voices calm but firm as they explained their complaint. "The attendant ignored us for 20 minutes, the man said, frustration flickering in his tone. Claire's smile was tight as she replied, "I'm sorry you feel that way, but our staff is trained to prioritize paying customers." "We are paying customers," the woman snapped, her voice rising slightly. Claire leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper meant to disarm. "There's no need to be aggressive," she said smoothly. Aggressive was a word Claire used often, a shield to deflect accountability. Back in the present, Claire glanced at her clipboard, scanning the passenger list. Her eyes lingered on Zoe Carter's name briefly before moving on without hesitation. She wasn't being cruel. She was maintaining standards. The door opened, and a colleague stepped inside. "You're really moving that girl out of first class?" he asked quietly, his tone uneasy. Claire didn't look up. "Protocol," she replied simply. The colleague hesitated before muttering under his breath, "It always seems to be protocol with you." He left without another word. Claire straightened her clipboard and stood, smoothing her uniform as she walked back into the cabin with practiced precision. The galley was cramped, its walls lined with coffee pots and trays of untouched snacks. A group of flight attendants huddled together, their voices low but urgent. Claire's name hung in the air like a shadow. "She's done this before," one attendant whispered, her eyes darting toward the cabin door. Jamal Thompson, a black flight attendant with years of experience, leaned against the counter, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "It's not the first time," he said quietly. "And it won't be the last unless someone speaks up." Another attendant hesitated, glancing at Jamal nervously. "She's been here 20 years. Complaints don't stick to people like her." He had seen complaints buried too many times, words dismissed as misunderstandings, actions justified as protocol. Jamal's voice was steady but edged with anger as he replied, "I filed a report about her last year. Know what I got? A memo about team cohesion." The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, their silence heavy with complicity. Speaking up wasn't just risky, it was exhausting, and most people didn't want to fight battles they weren't sure they could win. The cabin door swung open suddenly, and Claire stepped inside, clipboard in hand. The group scattered quickly, pretending to busy themselves with trays and cups. Jamal stayed where he was, his eyes meeting Claire's briefly before she looked away. Later, Jamal would confide in Marcus Carter. Complaints were always buried. But this time feels different. The hotel room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Marcus sat at the desk, his phone glowing in his hand. The video played on loop. Zoe walking down the aisle, her sketchbook clutched tightly, Claire following behind her with a clipboard. The caption read, #First Class While Black. Zoe stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. She hadn't spoken since they landed, but Marcus could feel the weight of her silence pressing against him. "Zoe," he said finally, his voice soft but hesitant. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "You always tell me to work harder," she said quietly. Marcus frowned slightly, unsure of where the conversation was going. "Because hard work matters," he replied. Zoe's voice trembled as she stepped closer to him. "But why do we have to be perfect?" she asked, her words sharp and raw. "Why do we have to prove we belong in every single room?" Marcus stared at her, his chest tightening under the weight of her question. He had spent his life building walls around them, walls of success, wealth, and influence. But none of it had been enough to protect her from moments like this. Zoe's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her sketchbook tighter. "I don't want to be perfect," she whispered. "I just want to exist without having to fight for it." Marcus looked down at his phone again, the video still playing silently on the screen. His silence spoke louder than any answer he could give. The conference room was cold, its walls lined with sleek glass and muted tones. A long table stretched across the center, where airline executives sat stiffly in their tailored suits. The video of Zoe's removal played on the large screen. At the front of the room, its silence broken only by the faint hum of the projector. One executive cleared his throat nervously. "This is bad PR," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Another shrugged dismissively, leaning back in his chair. "Claire's a veteran," he said. "She's been with us for 20 years. At the head of the table, Marcus Carter sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His gaze was fixed on the screen, where Zoe's walk down the aisle looped again and again. This wasn't just about Claire or Zoe, it was about every unchecked moment that had led to this one. "Do you think this will blow over?" Another executive asked cautiously, glancing around the room for agreement. Marcus's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "No." The room fell silent as he stood slowly, his presence commanding without effort. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly as he spoke. "She's done," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. One executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Marcus, we can't just—" Marcus slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "She's done," he repeated, his voice low but sharp. "This company will not protect people who strip others of their dignity." The silence that followed was heavy, each executive avoiding Marcus's gaze as they nodded reluctantly. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was everywhere. On news broadcasts, social media feeds, and even late-night talk shows. The caption, "Our First Class While Black," burned across the screen as Zoe's silent walk down the aisle played on loop. It wasn't just about Zoe anymore. It was about every moment of exclusion, every quiet humiliation that had gone unnoticed until. Now comments flooded in beneath the video. "This happened to me last week. She's just a kid? Hold them accountable." Protests erupted at airports across the country. Crowds gathered with signs reading, "Dignity has no class, and everyone belongs." A mother held up a photo of her teenage son with the words, "This is for him." News anchors debated the issue on live television. "Is this systemic bias at work?" one asked, while another replied, "It's hard to ignore the pattern here." The hashtag wasn't just a trend, it was a movement. Stories poured in from all over. A doctor downgraded mid-flight, a teenager barred from a boutique, a father followed in a grocery store. At home, Claire scrolled through her phone, her face pale as she read comment after comment. Her name had started trending alongside the hashtag, her actions dissected by strangers who didn't know her but seemed to understand her all too well. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down, staring blankly at the wall. For years she had operated with certainty, believing she was right, believing she was untouchable. But now, the world was watching. The roar of public outrage grew louder. Claire sat at her kitchen table, the glow of her phone casting harsh shadows across her face. The notifications buzzed endlessly, each one a reminder of how far the story had spread. She scrolled through the comments beneath her name. She's the problem. How many others has she humiliated? Fire her already. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down. For 20 years, she had been certain of her role, maintaining standards, protecting spaces. But now, those same actions were being dissected, judged, and condemned. The doorbell rang suddenly, breaking the silence. Claire hesitated before opening it to find her neighbor, Susan, standing awkwardly on the porch. "I just wanted to drop this off," Susan said, holding out a casserole dish. Her smile was tight, her eyes avoiding Claire's. Claire took the dish slowly. "Thanks," she said softly. Susan lingered for a moment before clearing her throat. "Well, take care," she muttered, before walking away quickly without looking back. Even those closest to Claire were beginning to pull away, not with words, but with distance. At work, it was worse. Co-workers avoided eye contact in the break room. A younger attendant snapped when Claire tried to offer advice. "I don't want trouble." The word stung more than any direct accusation could have. Later that evening, Claire's phone buzzed. Again. She picked it up hesitantly, only to see an email from HR. Termination notice. No severance, no farewell. Just a single line. Effective immediately. Claire stared at the screen, her reflection fractured in its glare. The press conference room was packed, cameras flashing as reporters jostled for position. Marcus Carter stood at the podium, his tailored suit immaculate, but his expression was heavy with purpose. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his movements calm and deliberate. "This isn't just about a single incident," Marcus began, his voice steady but sharp. "It's about a culture, a system that has allowed moments like this to happen, over and over again." The crowd murmured in agreement, pens scribbling furiously as Marcus continued. "This airline will now prioritize dignity over decorum. We will rebuild from the ground up, starting with accountability." A reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Carter, what specific actions will you take to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Marcus met her gaze directly. "We are implementing mandatory bias training for all staff. We are revising our hiring practices to prioritize diversity at every level. And we are creating an independent oversight committee to address complaints without fear of suppression." The room erupted into applause, but Marcus's thoughts lingered elsewhere. Zoe's words echoed in his mind. Why do we have to be perfect? He had built this airline to protect her, but even here, she had been made to prove herself. As the applause died down, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough to demand attention. "Dignity isn't given, it's claimed," he said firmly. In the back of the room, Zoe watched quietly, her sketchbook resting on her lap. She didn't clap. She didn't need to. Her father's words hung in the air like a promise. The newsroom buzzed with activity, reporters typing furiously as headlines flashed across screens. Jamal Thompson sat across from the lead journalist, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. A folder rested on the table between them, its edges worn from years of being ignored. "This is everything," Jamal said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Complaints filed against Claire Hendricks over the last decade. None of them went anywhere." The journalist opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages quickly. He had carried this burden for years, watching colleagues dismissed, passengers humiliated, and complaints buried under layers of bureaucracy. "There's a pattern here," the journalist said, her tone sharp. "Racial profiling, microaggressions, even outright discrimination." Jamal nodded slowly. Every time someone spoke up, it was labeled a misunderstanding or a one-off incident. But it wasn't. It was systemic. Flashback: Jamal stood in the break room years ago, holding a report in his hand. "Claire targeted that family," he said firmly to his supervisor. "You can't ignore this." The supervisor sighed, shaking his head dismissively. "We need to focus on team cohesion, Jamal. Don't stir things up." Back in the present, Jamal exhaled deeply as the journalist closed the folder and stood. "This will be published tomorrow," she said firmly. "People need to know." The next morning, headlines blasted across every major outlet. Airline enabled racism for decades. The CEO resigned quietly, his statement brief and devoid of apology. It wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was about a system that had protected her. Jamal watched the news from his apartment, his shoulders finally relaxing as years of silence began to break. The dining table was cluttered with pencils, markers, and sheets of paper filled with bold designs. Zoe sat in the center, her sketchbook open to a blank page. Her father's words from the press conference echoed in her mind. "Dignity isn't given. It's claimed." She picked up her pencil, her movement slow at first, then faster as the lines began to take shape. This wasn't just about reclaiming a seat. It was about creating spaces where no one would have to fight to belong. The design unfolded. A sleek airline uniform with clean lines and vibrant accents. Zoe added small details. A pin shaped like wings, a subtle but powerful message etched into the fabric. "Everyone belongs here." Marcus entered the room quietly, watching Zoe work from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He knew this was her way of processing everything that had happened. Her art had always been more than creativity. It was her voice, her way of shaping the world around her. Hours later, Marcus stood in a boardroom holding Zoe's sketch in his hands. "This will be the face of our new campaign," he said firmly to the executives gathered around him. "It's not just a design. It's a promise." The tagline flashed across the screen during the campaign launch. "Everyone belongs here." Zoe's art had become more than an expression. It was a symbol of change. Back at home, Marcus hung Zoe's drawing in his office, framing it carefully. He stared at it for a long moment before stepping back, his silence heavy with pride and resolve. The bus rattled down the city streets, its worn seats and peeling advertisements a stark contrast to the polished cabins Claire had once commanded. She sat near the back, her designer bag perched awkwardly on her lap, its sleek leather out of place in the dim, crowded interior. For 20 years she had walked through airports with confidence, believing she was untouchable. But now that certainty is gone, replaced by silence and isolation. A group of teenagers boarded noisily, their laughter filling the air as they found seats near Claire. One of them glanced at her briefly before nudging his friend and whispering, "Something. That's her," the boy muttered under his breath. "The racist lady from the video." Claire stiffened, her grip tightening on her bag. She stared out the window, pretending not to hear, but their words echoed in her mind. She had built a career on maintaining standards, on deciding who belonged and who didn't. But now she was the one being judged. The bus stopped at a red light, and Claire's reflection stared back at her from the glass, a fractured image of someone she barely recognized. Her name tag was gone, her uniform replaced by plain clothes that offered no shield from the world's scrutiny. As the bus pulled away from the stop, Claire closed her eyes briefly, wishing for anonymity that no longer existed. For years, she had wielded power without consequence. Now, she was just another passenger, unseen but not forgotten. The teenagers laughed again as they stepped off at their stop, leaving Claire alone with her reflection. The cabin door swung open mid-flight, the roar of engines momentarily drowning out murmurs. Marcus Carter stepped inside, his pilot's ID clutched in his hand. Claire froze, her clipboard slipping slightly as she recognized him. "You removed my daughter," Marcus said, his voice low but sharp. "Why?" Claire's smile tightened into a grimace. "Protocol, sir. There was a seating error." Marcus cut her off, stepping closer. "No. Prejudice." The word hung in the air, heavy and unignorable. Claire's gaze darted toward the passengers, who watched silently, their earlier indifference replaced by uneasy curiosity. 20 years of certainty dissolved in seconds under the weight of his stare. Marcus held up his ID, his tone icy. "This airline is mine. That seat was hers. Explain." Claire's throat tightened. I followed the procedure." "Procedure?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Procedure doesn't target children." A passenger's phone buzzed, loudly, the sound echoing in the silence. Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the drink cart behind her, her knuckles whitening. For years, Claire had hidden behind protocol. Now, it betrayed her. Marcus turned to the cabin, his voice steady but firm. "This ends today." The cabin was silent, the tension thick enough to cut through. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their curiosity battling with discomfort. Claire stood frozen near the drink cart, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. A man in a tailored suit finally broke the silence. He folded his newspaper deliberately, his voice cutting through the air like a verdict. "I've flown first class 100 times. No one's ever asked me for payment proof." All eyes turned to him, his words landing heavily in the quiet cabin. It wasn't just about Zoe anymore. It was about every unspoken rule that protected some and excluded others. Claire's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came out. Her polished composure began to crack under the weight of the moment. Another passenger, a woman with a pearl necklace, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "She's just a kid," she murmured softly, almost to herself, but loud enough for those around her to hear. The silence that had once protected Claire was breaking, fractured, by whispers that carried more power than shouts ever could. Marcus turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the cabin. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said firmly, addressing everyone and no one at once. "It's about who we choose to protect and who we choose to ignore." The man in the suit nodded slightly, his expression grim but resolute. Claire's knuckles whitened further as she gripped the cart for support, her confidence unraveling thread by thread. The cabin fell silent again, but this time it wasn't complicit. It was charged with quiet judgment. Claire stood frozen near the drink cart, her hands trembling as she gripped its edge. The polished metal felt cold against her skin, but she didn't let go. Marcus Carter's voice boomed across the cabin, cutting through her carefully constructed composure. "This airline will ground every plane," Marcus said firmly, his tone sharp and unyielding, "until every passenger she's wronged is compensated." Claire's breath hitched. She glanced at the passengers, hoping for some flicker of support, but their faces were unreadable, neutral yet heavy with silent judgment. For years she had operated with certainty, believing her actions were justified by protocol. But now that certainty was crumbling. Marcus stepped closer, his presence commanding without effort. "How many complaints have been filed against you?" he asked evenly. Claire swallowed hard, unable to answer. Her grip on the cart tightened until her knuckles turned white. A flight attendant near the galley whispered to a colleague, "He's not bluffing." The words carried across the cabin like a quiet revolt, amplifying the tension in the room. Marcus turned to the passengers again, his voice steady but piercing. "This isn't just about my daughter, it's about accountability." Claire's clipboard slipped from her grasp, clattering softly onto the floor. She bent down to retrieve it, her movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to hold on to what little control she had left. Her career, built on maintaining standards, was unraveling in seconds. Marcus didn't look at her again as he walked back toward his seat, leaving Claire standing alone in the aisle. The video hit social media before the plane even landed. A passenger had filmed Zoe's walk down the aisle, her sketchbook clutched tightly, Claire trailing behind her with a clipboard. The caption read, #FirstClassWhileBlack. It wasn't just a video, it was a mirror reflecting every unspoken rule that had excluded people for decades. Within hours, the hashtag was trending worldwide. Stories poured in from all corners of the internet. "This happened to me last week. My son was downgraded mid-flight. Hold them accountable." Protests erupted at airports across the country. Crowds gathered with signs reading, "Dignity," "Has no class," and "Everyone belongs." A black teenager held up a sign that read, "I was Zoe." News anchors debated the issue on live television. "Is this systemic bias at work?" one asked, while another replied, "It's hard to ignore the pattern here." At home, Claire sat on her couch, scrolling through her phone. Her name was trending alongside the hashtag, dissected by strangers who didn't know her but seemed to understand her actions all too well. Comments flooded beneath her name. "She's the problem. How many others has she humiliated?" "Fire her already." Claire's hand trembled as she set the phone down, staring blankly at the wall. For years she had operated with certainty, believing she was right, believing she was untouchable. But now the world was watching. The roar of public outrage grew louder, drowning out every excuse Claire had once relied on. The cockpit was dimly lit, the control panels glowing softly as the plane cruised through the night sky. The pilot adjusted his headset, his voice calm but deliberate as he radioed headquarters. "This is Flight 372. We're diverting all flights connected to the incident," he said evenly, his tone betraying no emotion. The airline was no longer brushing this under the rug. The ripple effects of our first class, while black, were forcing action, one flight at a time. In the cabin, Marcus Carter sat by the window, his posture tense but composed. Zoe's sketchbook rested on his lap, open to a page filled with bold lines and unfinished designs. Her art had always been her voice, a way to reclaim space in a world that tried to push her out. Behind him, whispers filled the galley. Two flight attendants exchanged hurried words as they stacked trays and cups. "Did you hear? They're grounding flights," one whispered, her tone tinged with disbelief. The other nodded grimly. "It's because of Claire." Jamal Thompson leaned against the counter nearby, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "It's not just Claire," he said quietly. "It's everything she represents." The attendants fell silent, their unease palpable, as Jamal's words hung in the air like a verdict. For years people had whispered about moments like these, moments of exclusion and quiet humiliation. But now those whispers were growing louder. Marcus stared out the window at the clouds below, his grip tightening on Zoe's sketchbook. The key world outside was still, but inside, change was finally taking flight. The HR office was silent except for the faint hum of a computer screen. Claire sat stiffly in the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the desk, her supervisor avoided eye contact, his fingers tapping nervously against the keyboard. "We've reviewed the incident," he began, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." Claire's breath caught, but she didn't speak. 20 years of service reduced to a single sentence. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to her. The supervisor continued without looking up. "Your access badge has been deactivated. You'll receive instructions on returning your uniform." Claire nodded mechanically, her face pale as she processed the words. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, protected by protocol and seniority. But now those shields have shattered. As she stood to leave, she glanced at the desk where her nameplate had once rested. It was gone, replaced by an empty space that felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. In the break room, co-workers whispered quietly as Claire walked past them with her belongings in a small box. One attendant muttered under her breath, "She brought this on herself." For years, Claire had been feared and respected in equal measure. Now, she was just another name on a termination notice. Claire reached the door and paused briefly before stepping outside into the cold air. Her grip on the box tightened as she walked away from the building that had once been her domain. The dining table was covered in scattered pencils, markers, and sheets of paper filled with bold designs. Zoe sat in the center, her sketchbook open, to a page she had started but never finished. This wasn't just about creating something beautiful. It was about making a statement, a space where everyone belonged. She picked up her pencil, her movements slow at first, then faster as the lines began to take shape. The design unfolded, a sleek airline uniform with clean lines and vibrant accents. She added subtle details, a pin shaped like wings and a small inscription on the cuff that read, "Belonging has no seat number." Marcus entered the room quietly, watching Zoe work from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He knew this was her way of processing everything that had happened. Her art had always been more than creativity. It was her voice, her way of reclaiming space in a world that tried to push her out. Later that week, Marcus stood in a boardroom holding Zoe's sketch in his hands. "This will be the face of our new campaign," he said firmly to the executives gathered around him. "It's not just a design, it's a promise." The tagline flashed across screens during the campaign launch. "Belonging has no seat number." Zoe's art had become more than an expression. It was now a symbol of change. Back at home, Marcus carefully framed Zoe's drawing and hung it on the wall of his office. He stared at it for a long moment before stepping back, his silence heavy with pride and resolve. The cabin was quiet except for the faint hum of the engines. Claire stood at the front, gripping the PA microphone tightly in her hand. Her uniform was crisp, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "We apologize for the inconvenience," she said, her tone rehearsed, but strained. A passenger near the aisle scoffed loudly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Inconvenience? Try humiliation." Claire flinched slightly, her grip tightening on the microphone. And for years she had delivered announcements with authority, believing she was maintaining order. Now every word felt hollow. She glanced at the passengers, hoping for some flicker of understanding, but their faces were cold and distant. A woman adjusted her scarf without looking up. A man folded his arms and stared out at the window. Claire cleared her throat and tried again. "We are working to ensure this doesn't happen again," she said softly, her voice trembling. Another passenger muttered under his breath, "It shouldn't have happened in the first place." Her career, built on maintaining standards, was unraveling in front of her. The authority she had clung to for 20 years was gone. As Claire finished the announcement and stepped away from the microphone, her hands trembled visibly. She avoided eye contact as she walked back to the galley, her steps slow and deliberate. Behind her, whispers filled the cabin, quiet but cutting, as passengers exchanged glances and murmured about what had unfolded. Claire's presence no longer commanded respect, it only invited judgment. The boardroom was silent, its sleek glass walls reflecting the tension in the air. Marcus Carter stood at the head of the table, his hands resting firmly on the polished surface. The shareholders sat stiffly in their seats, their gazes fixed on him, as they waited for him to speak. "This company failed," Marcus began, his voice steady but sharp. "It failed my daughter. It failed countless others who were told they didn't belong." One shareholder cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Carter, we've already terminated Claire Hendricks." Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't just about her," he said firmly. "It's about the system that protected her actions for 20 years. He had spent his life building walls of success and influence, believing they would shield Zoe from moments like this. But those walls had crumbled under the weight of systemic bias." Marcus turned toward the empty chair at the far end of the table. The nameplate that had once read Claire Hendricks was gone, replaced by a blank space that felt heavier than any confrontation could have been. "We're rebuilding, starting with accountability," Marcus continued, his tone resolute. "Every complaint that was buried will be revisited. Every passenger who was wronged will be compensated, and every employee who perpetuated exclusion will face consequences." The shareholders exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded slowly, their silence an acknowledgement of the inevitable shift. The empty chair wasn't just Claire's. It was a symbol of a system that had finally been called to account. Marcus stepped back from the table, his presence commanding even in silence. The city bus rattled over uneven streets, its worn seats and peeling advertisements a far cry from the polished cabins Claire had once commanded. She sat near the back, her designer bag perched awkwardly on her lap, its sleek leather out of place among the faded upholstery. For 20 years, she had walked through airports with confidence, believing she belonged in spaces others could only dream of. But now that certainty was gone, replaced by silence and isolation. The bus stopped at a red light, and Claire's reflection stared back at her from the scratched window, a fractured image of someone she barely recognized. Her name tag was gone, her uniform replaced by plain clothes that offered no shield from the world's scrutiny. A group of teenagers boarded noisily, their laughter filling the air as they found seats near Claire. One of them glanced at her briefly before nudging his friend and whispering something. "That's her," the boy muttered under his breath. "The racist lady from the video." Claire stiffened, her grip tightening on her bag. She stared out the window, pretending not to hear, but their words echoed in her mind. She had built a career on maintaining standards, on deciding who belonged and who didn't. But now, she was the one being judged. The teenagers laughed again as they stepped off at their stop, leaving Claire alone with her reflection. The bus continued its journey through the city, carrying Claire further into anonymity. For years she had wielded power without consequence. Now she was just another passenger, unseen but not forgotten. Claire closed her eyes briefly, wishing for a silence that never came. Claire stood at her locker, her hands moving mechanically as she placed her belongings into a small cardboard box. A coworker walked by, eyes fixed on the floor, and muttered a hurried, "Excuse me," before disappearing down the hallway. Another colleague paused briefly, her voice soft but distant. "Need help?" Claire shook her head without looking. "Up?" No, the woman hesitated, then walked away. 20 years of service reduced to a box of pens, a spare uniform, and silence. A nearby TV screen flickered with a news headline: "Airline CEO fires 20 employees linked to racial profiling." Claire's name scrolled across the ticker. She froze, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the locker. "Did you see the news?" a voice asked from behind. Claire turned to find Jamal standing there, his expression unreadable. She didn't answer. Jamal's voice was calm but firm. "They're finally holding people accountable." Claire's jaw tightened. "I followed protocol." Jamal shook his head slightly. "Protocol doesn't target kids." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Claire turned back to her locker, slamming it shut with a hollow clang. The sound echoed down the empty hallway as she walked away, box in hand. Claire stood in front of her locker for the last time, her hands trembling as she adjusted the box in her arms. The hallway was eerily quiet, the usual hum of conversation replaced by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. She reached inside the locker, pulling out the final remnants of her career: a worn notebook, a pen, and her name tag. The name tag slipped from her fingers as she placed the items into the box. It fell to the floor with a soft clink, landing face down. Claire stared at it for a moment, her breath catching slightly. That name tag had once been a symbol of authority, of belonging. Now it was just another discarded piece of her past. She crouched down slowly to pick it up, but hesitated. Her hand hovered over it for a moment before she stood back up, leaving it where it lay. A coworker walked by, glancing briefly at Claire before quickly averting their gaze. The sound of their footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Claire alone. Again. She closed the locker door with deliberate care, the metallic clang echoing louder than it should have. For years, Claire had wielded power without question. But now, even the smallest gesture felt heavy with judgment. As she walked away, her footsteps were slow and measured, each step carrying her further from what she had built and lost. The name tag remained on the floor behind her, unnoticed and forgotten. The room was quiet except for the faint scratch of a pencil against paper. Zoe sat at her desk, her sketchbook open in front of her. The page was blank when she started, but now bold lines began to take form, shapes that carried the weight of everything she had felt on that flight. It wasn't just about what happened to her. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Her art wasn't just an outlet. It was a way to reclaim space. She paused, staring at the half-finished drawing. It showed a tarmac, empty except for a single discarded name tag lying in the center. Around it were footprints heading in different directions, some large, some small, all moving forward. Her father knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. "You've been at this all day," Marcus said gently, his tone careful not to intrude. Zoe didn't look up. "I'm almost done," she replied quietly, her pencil moving again. Marcus walked closer, standing behind her as he studied the sketch. He noticed the detail in the name tag, the faint letters spelling out Claire Hendricks. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't say anything. "You think it's too much?" Zoe asked suddenly, glancing back at him. Marcus shook his head, his voice steady but full of emotion. "No," he said softly. "It's honest." Zoe nodded and turned back to her sketchbook, adding the final touches to the footprints. Her art wasn't just hers anymore. It was a reflection of something bigger, something that couldn't be erased. She closed the sketchbook gently and leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. The conference room was filled with quiet murmurs, as employees filed in, taking their seats. At the front, Jamal Thompson adjusted his tie, his hands steady, but his expression thoughtful. The podium in front of him felt heavier than it looked. For years he had watched complaints buried, voices silenced, and moments of exclusion dismissed as misunderstandings. Now he stood here with a chance to change that. The room fell silent as Jamal stepped forward. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Today isn't about blame. It's about building something better." A few heads nodded in agreement, but others remained still, their expressions unreadable. Jamal continued, his tone unwavering. "For too long, this company has operated on unspoken rules, rules that protect some and exclude others. That ends. Now," he paused, letting his words settle into the room before continuing. "As the new Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion, my job isn't just to fix what's broken, it's to make sure it stays fixed." A woman near the back raised her hand hesitantly. "What does that mean for us?" she asked softly. Jamal met her gaze directly. "It means accountability," he said simply. "It means listening to voices that have been ignored and making sure those voices are heard moving forward." This wasn't just about policy changes, it was about reshaping the culture of an entire industry. As the room erupted into applause, Jamal stepped back from the podium, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time in years, it felt like progress. The auditorium was filled with employees, reporters, and community leaders. Marcus Carter stood on the stage, his presence commanding yet calm. Behind him, a large screen displayed Zoe's sketch, a sleek airline uniform with bold lines and vibrant accents. The tagline beneath it read, "Everyone belongs in every seat." Marcus adjusted the microphone slightly, his voice steady as he began. "This isn't just a campaign, it's a commitment to dignity, to inclusion, to accountability." The audience murmured softly, their attention fixed on the screen as Marcus continued. "For years, this industry has operated on invisible barriers. Barriers that dictate who belongs and who doesn't. Today, we're tearing those barriers down." This wasn't about damage control anymore. It was about systemic change, about creating spaces where people like Zoe didn't have to fight to belong. He gestured toward the screen. "This design," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride, "was created by my daughter. It represents everything we stand for moving forward: boldness, inclusion, and the belief that everyone deserves a seat at the table or on the plane." The room erupted into applause as Marcus stepped back from the podium. This wasn't just a corporate initiative, it was a promise to every passenger who had ever been told they didn't belong. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his office, staring at Zoe's framed sketch on the wall. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply as he reflected on everything that had led to this moment. This was only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. The airport was bustling with activity, the familiar hum of announcements echoing through the terminal. Zoe Carter walked toward the gate, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. This wasn't just another flight. It was a moment she had reclaimed. As she stepped onto the plane, a flight attendant greeted her warmly. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Carter," the woman said with a genuine smile. Zoe nodded politely, her composure calm but proud. She glanced at the first-class cabin as she walked down the aisle, her eyes lingering briefly on seat 1A, the same seat she had been asked to leave weeks ago. This time, there was no hesitation, no questioning of her right to be here. She settled into her seat, placing her sketchbook on the tray table in front of her. The design she had created for the airline's new uniforms flashed across the in-flight screen, accompanied by the tagline, "Everyone belongs in every seat." The passenger beside her glanced at the screen and then at Zoe's sketchbook. "That's yours?" he asked curiously. Zoe nodded. "It is." The man smiled faintly, his tone thoughtful as he replied, "It's about time someone said it." Her art wasn't just hers anymore. It was a symbol of change, a reflection of something bigger than herself. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Zoe leaned back in her seat, exhaling deeply. The flight attendant passed by again, offering her a drink with another warm smile. Zoe accepted it without hesitation, reclaiming the space that had once tried to push her out. The news spread quickly. Airlines across the country began announcing diversity initiatives inspired by Marcus Carter's campaign. What started as a single moment of exclusion had sparked industry-wide reform. A headline flashed across a television screen in a bustling cafe. "Major airlines commit to mandatory bias training and inclusive hiring practices." A group of college students watched the broadcast, nodding in approval. "This is huge," one of them said, scrolling through their phone. "Finally, someone's doing something about it." On social media, stories poured in under hashtags like "Belonging Matters" and "Check Your Bias." A black doctor shared her experience of being downgraded mid-flight. A teenager posted about being asked for proof of purchase at a boutique. Each story added to the wave of change, amplifying voices that had been silenced for too long. Marcus sat in his office, reading through emails from other CEOs who had reached out to commend his initiative. One message stood out: "Your campaign has inspired us to reevaluate our policies. Thank you for leading the way." He leaned back in his chair, glancing at Zoe's framed sketch on the wall. This wasn't just about fixing one airline, it was about reshaping an entire industry. At an airport protest, a young girl held up a sign that read, "I was Zoe." Her mother stood beside her, tears in her eyes as she watched the crowd chant, "Everyone belongs!" The movement was growing, its momentum unstoppable. What began with a single flight had become a call to action, a promise that no one would have to fight for their place again. The apartment was dim, the only light coming from the glow of Claire's phone screen. She sat on the couch, scrolling through stories shared under the first-class while black. Her face was pale, her expression distant. For years she had operated with certainty, believing she was maintaining order, protecting standards. But now those same actions were being dissected, judged, and condemned. She paused on one post, a video of Zoe walking down the aisle, her sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest. The caption read, "This is what exclusion looks like." Claire's hand trembled as she set the phone down. She stared at the dark screen for a moment before catching her reflection in it. Her reflection looked unfamiliar, tired, regretful, and unmoored from the certainty she once carried. She stood slowly and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. The streets were alive with movement, cars rushing by, people walking, hurriedly. But Claire felt disconnected from it all. A knock at the door broke the silence. She opened it to find her neighbor standing awkwardly with a casserole dish in hand. "I thought you might need this," the woman said softly, avoiding Claire's gaze. Claire took the dish without a word. "Thanks," she murmured. The neighbor lingered for a moment before clearing her throat. "Well, take care," she muttered before walking away quickly. Claire closed the door and set the dish on the counter. For years she had wielded power without consequence. Now even kindness felt distant, offered out of pity rather than respect. She leaned against the counter, staring blankly ahead as silence filled the room. The porch was quiet except for the faint chirping of crickets in the distance. Marcus and Zoe sat side by side, their chairs angled slightly toward the horizon where the sun was dipping below the treetops. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it a calm that neither of them had felt in weeks. Marcus held a glass of iced tea in his hand, staring at the condensation as it dripped down the side. Zoe's sketchbook rested on her lap, unopened, her fingers tracing its edges absent-mindedly. "I saw your design," Marcus said finally, his voice low but steady. Zoe didn't look at him. "Did you like it?" Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "It's more than a design," he replied. "It's a message." He had spent years building walls of success and influence, believing they would protect her from moments like the one on that flight. But those walls hadn't been enough. Zoe shifted slightly in her chair, her tone hesitant but firm. "You always told me to work harder," she said quietly. Marcus turned to look at her, his expression heavy with regret. "I did." "Why do we have to be perfect to belong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus exhaled deeply, setting his glass down on the small table between them. "We shouldn't have to be," he admitted, his voice breaking the silence like a confession. "You were right." Zoe glanced at him briefly before turning back to the horizon. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. For the first time they sat together not as father and daughter, but as equals in understanding. The auditorium was packed, the hum of anticipation filling the air. Marcus Carter stood at the podium, his tailored suit immaculate, but his expression was heavy with purpose. Behind him, a large screen displayed the words, "Dignity isn't given, it's claimed." He adjusted the microphone slightly, his movements deliberate. The applause died down as he began to speak. "This isn't just about one flight," Marcus said, his voice steady but resonant. "It's about a system, a culture that has allowed moments like this to happen over and over again." The audience listened intently, their eyes fixed on him. He had spent years building walls to protect Zoe, believing success would shield her from exclusion. But those walls hadn't been enough. Marcus gestured toward the screen. "Dignity isn't something that can be handed out or taken away," he continued. "It's something we claim for ourselves, and something we must ensure for others." The room erupted into applause, but Marcus's focus shifted briefly to the back of the auditorium. Zoe sat quietly in her seat, her sketchbook open on her lap. She wasn't clapping. She didn't need to. Her father's words hung in the air like a promise. This wasn't just about corporate accountability. It was about reclaiming spaces that had been denied for too long. As the applause faded, Marcus stepped back from the podium, his presence commanding even in silence. The camera panned to Zoe, who was sketching quietly in her seat, her movements calm but purposeful. The fight for dignity wasn't over, but it had begun with a single voice that refused to be silenced.